If you're new here, hit that subscribe button before we begin and turn on notifications. What you're about to hear might change how you see the world, faith, and the unexpected wisdom that can come from life's most difficult moments. Trust me, you don't want to miss this story. The question came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Jon Jones was sitting on a park bench, watching golden autumn leaves spiral down from the maples overhead. The past year had hollowed him out, carved away pieces. Of him he'd never get back. 43 years old, and somehow he felt both ancient and unformed, as if grief had reset his life counter to zero, leaving him to figure out who he was all over again. He'd started coming to this park 3 months ago, when returning to an empty house had become unbearable. Here, surrounded by joggers and dog walkers, and children on the playground, he could pretend to be part of the world again. No one knew him here. No one approached with awkward condolences or well-meaning platitudes. He could sit, anonymous in his pain, and watch life continuing all around him. Jon checked his watch, nearly 4 o'clock. Soon the after-school crowd would arrive, parents with elementary-aged children filling the playground. He usually left, before then uncomfortable around so much vibrant family life. But today, he'd become distracted by a manuscript he was editing, losing track of time as he scribbled notes in the margins. As a senior editor at Horizon Publishing, he'd thrown himself into work after Sarah and Ella's accident, taking on extra projects to fill the endless hours, to exhaust himself enough that sleep might come without pharmaceutical assistance. As he gathered his papers, a small voice came from beside the bench. "Are you a writer?" Jon looked up to find a girl of about 7 or 8 watching him curiously. She had unruly dark curls escaping from 2 mismatched barrettes and wore a purple jacket with a unicorn patch sewn crookedly onto one pocket. Behind her thick glasses, her eyes were solemn and appraising. "No," Jon said, surprised to be addressed. "I'm an editor. I help writers make their books better." The girl nodded as if this confirmed something important. "My name is Maya. I'm in 2nd grade. My mum is over there." She pointed toward a woman on a nearby bench who glanced up from her phone and gave Jon a small, apologetic wave. "She says, I ask too many questions to strangers." Despite himself, Jon felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward. "Questions are important," he said. "It's how we learn things." Maya beamed at this validation. "That's what I think too." She rocked back and forth on her heels, studying him. "Can I ask you a question?" Jon checked his watch again. He should go, retreat to the quiet sanctuary of his home office, away from chatty children who made his chest ache with memories. But something in the girl's earnest expression made him nod. "1 question," he agreed. "Then I need to go." Maya's face grew serious, her brow furrowing above her glasses. She seemed to be gathering her courage. Jon expected a question about his job or perhaps something charmingly nonsensical, as children often asked. Instead, she looked directly into his eyes and asked, "Do you think God is real?" The question hit Jon like a physical blow. Of all the things she could have asked, this was the one he was least prepared for. He stared at her, momentarily speechless, as memories crashed over him. The screeching tires, the shattered glass, the funeral with 2 caskets, one heartbreakingly small, the endless unanswered prayers that had followed. "That's a big question," he finally managed, his voice rougher than he intended. Maya nodded solemnly. "I know. That's why I'm asking grown-ups. My mum says she doesn't know. My teacher says, yes, my friend Jaden says his dad says it's all made up." She frowned slightly. "But I want to know what's true." Jon glanced toward Maya's mother, who was now watching their interaction more attentively. He should excuse himself, tell the girl to ask someone else, someone whose faith hadn't been ground to dust beneath the weight of unbearable loss. But there was something in her expression, an earnestness that deserved honesty, even if he wasn't sure what his honest answer was anymore. "Why are you asking about this?" he countered, buying himself time. Maya scuffed her shoe against the ground. "My grandma died last month. She lived with us. Everyone says she's in heaven now, but..." She trailed off, her small shoulders lifting in a shrug that conveyed more doubt than the gesture usually carried. Understanding dawned. This wasn't just childish curiosity. This was a young mind grappling with mortality, with the fundamental questions that loss forces upon us at any age. Jon recognized the confusion in her eyes, the need to make sense of an absence where presence had always been. "I'm sorry about your grandmother," he said quietly. "She made the best pancakes," Maya offered, as if this detail was crucial to Jon's understanding of who her grandmother had been, with chocolate chips in the shape of a smile, and she knew all the dinosaur names, even the hard ones. Jon nodded, feeling something crack open inside his chest. "She sounds wonderful." "She was," Maya agreed, "but now she's gone, and I keep wondering where she went." Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "So, do you think God is real? And heaven? Is my grandma really there?" Jon looked at this child, her face open and trusting, waiting for an answer that could shape her understanding of life and death. He thought of the countless books on grief he'd edited over the years, the philosophical treatises on faith and doubt, the memoirs of loss and recovery. None of them had prepared him for this moment, for this question from this child, on this autumn afternoon. A year ago, his answer would have been different. Before the accident, he'd been comfortably agnostic, respectful of Sarah's casual Episcopalianism, accompanying her and Ella to Christmas Eve services and Easter Sunday, finding value in the ritual and community, if not the theology. After the accident, he'd cycled through rage at a God he didn't believe in, desperate bargaining with a deity he suddenly wanted to exist, and finally, a cold, empty acceptance that the universe was random and cruel, and that meaning was merely something humans invented to comfort themselves in the face of chaos. But looking at Maya, he couldn't bring himself to say any of that. "I lost someone too," Jon found himself saying, the words emerging before he'd fully decided to speak them. "My wife and my daughter, last year." He swallowed hard. "They were everything to me." Maya's eyes widened behind her glasses. "What were their names?" "Sarah and Ella," Jon said, realizing he hadn't spoken their names aloud to a stranger in months. "Ella was a little older than you. She was 9. Maya absorbed this information with the directness only children can manage. "And did they go to heaven?" Jon looked up at the canopy of leaves above them, golden and red in the late afternoon sun. For months after the accident, he'd been unable to notice beauty in the world, as if his capacity for it had died along with Sarah and Ella. Lately, though, he'd found himself pausing, struck by a sunset, or the pattern of rain on a window, or, like now, the simple miracle of leaves changing color. "I don't know if heaven exists the way people talk about it," he said finally, choosing his words with care. "With clouds and angels and gates, I'm not sure about that." Maya's face fell slightly, but she continued to watch him, waiting. "But I do know this," Jon continued, surprising himself with the certainty he suddenly felt. "Love doesn't just disappear. It doesn't just end. The love I have for Sarah and Ella is still here." He pressed his hand against his chest. "I carry it with me every day. And the love your grandmother had for you, her pancake-making, dinosaur-naming love, that's still here too. You're carrying it right now." Maya considered this, her head tilted slightly. "But that's not the same as her being here." "No," Jon agreed, his voice gentle. "It's not the same. And it's okay to be sad about that. I'm sad every day that Sarah and Ella aren't here with me." "Does it hurt?" Maya asked, her voice small. Jon nodded. "Yes. But you know what? The hurt is connected to the love. Sometimes I think they're two sides of the same thing. We hurt so much because we loved so much, and in a strange way I wouldn't want the hurt to go away because it's part of how I still love them." Maya was quiet for a long moment, digesting this. "But what about God?" she persisted, returning to her original question. Jon took a deep breath. "Here's what I think. I think that real love, the kind that lasts even after someone is gone, is the closest thing to God that we can touch and feel in this world. I think maybe God is in how we love each other, in how we remember each other, in how we carry each other even when we're apart." As he spoke, Jon realized he wasn't just offering comfortable words to a grieving child. Something in him had shifted, some frozen place beginning to thaw. The words felt true as he said them, truer than anything he'd allowed himself to believe in the past year. "So," Maya said slowly, processing, "my grandma is in heaven, but heaven is really the love we had." "Maybe heaven isn't a place we go," Jon suggested softly. "Maybe it's what we leave behind in the hearts of the people who loved us. To his horror, Jon saw tears welling up in Maya's eyes, spilling over onto her cheeks. He'd made a child cry in a public park. Her mother would be rushing over any second, accusing him of upsetting her daughter. He should never have engaged in this conversation, never have attempted to address questions that theologians and philosophers had wrestled with for millennia. "I'm sorry," he began, but Maya shook her head fiercely. "No," she said, her voice wavering but determined. "Don't be sorry, I'm crying because—" She paused, searching for words, "because that's the most beautiful thing anyone has said. And I think it might be true." Jon felt his own eyes burning. He hadn't cried since the funeral, had locked away his grief behind walls of numbness and routine. But now, faced with this child's simple recognition of beauty in his fumbling attempt to make sense of loss, something broke loose inside him. Maya pulled a slightly crumpled tissue from her pocket and solemnly offered it to him. "It's clean," she assured him. "My mum always makes me carry one." Jon accepted it with equal solemnity, dabbing at his eyes. "Your mum sounds smart." "She is," Maya agreed. "She's a scientist. She studies rocks from space." With the resilience of childhood, she'd already moved from tears to conversation. Though her eyes remained thoughtful behind her glasses, Jon glanced again toward Maya's mother, who was watching them with a mixture of curiosity and concern. He gave her a small nod, hoping to communicate that all was well. "Maya," her mother called. "Time to go, honey. Dad's waiting with dinner." "I have to go now," Maya said, stating the obvious. "But thank you for answering my question." She hesitated, then added, "I bet Ella was really nice." "She was," Jon said, his voice thick. "She loved unicorns, too." He gestured to the patch on Maya's jacket. Maya's face lit up. "Really?" Jon nodded. "She had unicorn sheets and a unicorn lamp and about a dozen unicorn stuffed animals." "I have 17, Maya said proudly. "But my mom says that's the limit, unless I get rid of some old ones." "That seems fair," Jon replied, feeling the ghost of a smile touch his lips. Maya studied him for a moment longer, then impulsively stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him in a quick hug. Before Jon could react, she was pulling away, running toward her mother with her curls bouncing behind her. "Wait," Jon called after her. "I never asked what your question was for your mum." Maya turned, walking backward as she answered. "I asked her if love can last forever." She said yes. She waved once more, then took her mother's outstretched hand. Jon sat motionless on the bench long after Maya and her mother had disappeared from view. The encounter had lasted perhaps 15 minutes, but he felt fundamentally altered by it. For months he'd been moving through life as if underwater, sounds muffled, colors dulled, everything happening at a remove. But this conversation with a curious second grader had pulled him momentarily to the surface, allowed him to gulp a breath of clear air. He gathered his papers, his movements deliberate. Instead of heading directly home as planned, he found himself walking to the small playground where Maya had likely been headed. It was busy now with after-school children, their voices high and excited as they claimed swings and slides after a day of classroom confinement. Jon sat on an empty bench at the edge of the play area, watching as children negotiated turns, formed fleeting alliances, dissolved into disagreements that were forgotten moments later. He hadn't allowed himself to be around children Ella's age since the accident. It had seemed an unnecessary cruelty, a reminder of all he had lost. But now, he found a strange comfort in their energy, their unfiltered emotions, their absorption. In the present moment, a memory surfaced sharp and clear. Ella, at this very playground perhaps 2 years ago, finally brave enough to cross the monkey bars alone. "Watch me, Daddy," she'd called, her face a mixture of determination and fear. "I'm not going to fall this time." And she hadn't fallen. She'd made it across, one bar at a time, her face transformed by triumph as she dropped safely to the other side. Sarah had captured the moment on her phone, and for weeks afterward, Ella had insisted on watching the video every night before bed, reliving her victory. The memory should have been painful, and it was, a deep ache that would never fully heal. But alongside the pain was something else. Gratitude. Gratitude that he had been there to witness that moment, that he had been the one Ella had called to watch her courage. Gratitude for the 9 years they'd had together, even if it had been far too short, Is my grandma really in heaven? Maya had asked. Jon didn't know the answer to that question, not with certainty, but he was beginning to think that maybe heaven wasn't the point. Maybe the point was that Maya's grandmother had loved her enough to make pancakes with chocolate, chip smiles, had taken the time to learn dinosaur names that mattered to her granddaughter. Maybe the point was that Sarah had held the phone steady to capture Ella's triumph on the monkey bars, knowing even then that moments like these were precious beyond measure. Jon took out his phone, navigating to a folder he hadn't opened in months. There they were, Sarah and Ella, hundreds of photos documenting their life together. Sarah laughing in the kitchen, flour on her cheek from a baking project gone awry. Ella concentrating fiercely as she learned to ride a bike. The three of them squished together in a vacation selfie, sunburned and happy. He scrolled slowly, allowing himself to really look at each image, to feel the love captured in each pixel. Maybe heaven isn't a place we go. Maybe it's what we leave behind in the hearts of the people who loved us. His own words came back to him, and with them, a realization. He had been so focused on what he had lost, the future he would never have with Sarah and Ella, that he had been in danger of losing something else, the past they had shared, the love that had shaped his life. In trying to numb his pain, he had numbed everything, including the very memories that kept Sarah and Ella present in the world, as the playground gradually emptied, parents calling children home for dinner. Jon remained on the bench scrolling through his phone. For the first time in a year, he allowed himself to remember not just that Sarah and Ella had died, but that they had lived, vibrantly, imperfectly, wonderfully lived. And in remembering their lives rather than just their absence, he felt them, with him in a way he hadn't since the accident. Jon wasn't sure if this was God, this love that persisted beyond death, this connection that transcended physical presence. He wasn't sure if Sarah and Ella were in heaven, watching over him, aware of his grief. But he was beginning to believe that something of them remained, not just in his memories, but in how they had changed him, in how loving them had made him more fully human. As darkness began to fall, Jon finally rose from the bench. Tomorrow he would come back to this park, not to hide from his grief, but to sit with it, to allow it to exist alongside gratitude for what he'd had. Perhaps he would bring one of Ella's unicorns, leave it on this bench for another child to find. Perhaps he would finally call Sarah's. Parents, who had been reaching out to him for months, their messages increasingly concerned as he retreated from connection. A year of running from his pain had left him exhausted and no less broken. Maybe it was time to try something else, to walk toward the memory of love instead of away from the reality of loss, to allow himself to be both wounded and healing, both devastated and grateful, both alone and connected to something larger than himself. As Jon walked home through the gathering dusk, he found himself whispering names like a prayer. Sarah, Ella. The sound of them in the air felt right, a small act of keeping them present in the world. He couldn't bring them back, couldn't change what had happened on that rainy afternoon a year ago, but he could carry them with him, could continue to love them in the only way now possible, by remembering, by speaking their names, by recognizing their imprint on his life. "Do you think God is real?" Maya had asked. Jon still didn't have a definitive answer. But for the first time since losing Sarah and Ella, he was open to the possibility that even in a broken world, even in the face of unbearable loss, there might be something sacred in how we love each other, in how that love endures beyond separation, beyond even death. And that possibility, however fragile, was enough to help him take the next step, and the next, carrying his grief and his love together as he made his way home through the autumn evening. 3 days later, Jon returned to the park at the same time. He'd found himself hoping to see Maya again, to thank her for the unexpected gift her question had given him. He brought with him a small book, one he'd edited years ago about a girl and her magical unicorn friend who helped her through difficult times. Ella had loved it. He'd read it to her countless times. Now it sat on the bench beside him as he worked, a small offering if Maya happened to appear. But it wasn't Maya who approached him as the afternoon waned. Instead, it was her mother, looking slightly hesitant as she stopped in front of his bench. "Hi," she said. "You're the editor Maya talked to the other day? About her grandmother?" Jon nodded, closing his manuscript. "Yes. I hope I didn't say anything." Inappropriate. She asked some pretty profound questions. The woman smiled, the resemblance to her daughter striking in the curve of her mouth. That's Maya. Always has been, asking questions that leave adults stumbling for answers. She extended her hand. I'm Layla, by the way. Jon, he replied, shaking her hand. Jon Jones. Maya hasn't stopped talking about your conversation, Layla said, settling on the bench beside him when he gestured for her to join him. She told me what you said about heaven being the love we leave behind. It was exactly what she needed to hear, I think. So thank you for that. Jon felt a warmth spread through him at her words. I wasn't sure if I'd said the right thing. I'm not exactly an expert on theology. Neither am I, Layla admitted. I'm an astrophysicist. I spend my days looking at meteorite samples and thinking about the formation of the solar system. The big existential questions aren't really in my wheelhouse. She glanced at him sideways. Maya mentioned that you lost your wife and daughter. I'm so sorry. Jon nodded, accepting her condolence without the usual discomfort. A year ago. Car. Accident. Layla was quiet for a moment. That explains why you were able to talk to Maya the way you did. About grief, my mother lived with us for 5 years before she died. Maya was extremely close to her. Maya said she made chocolate chip pancakes, Jon offered, and knew dinosaur names. She did, Layla confirmed, a smile touching her lips. Mom was a paleontologist before she retired. She nurtured Maya's curiosity about everything. Sometimes, I think she's the reason Maya asks so many questions. Mom always took her seriously, always gave her real answers instead of brushing her off. She sounds wonderful, Jon said. She was, Layla agreed. The house feels emptier without her. She glanced at him again. Maya also mentioned that your daughter liked unicorns. Jon smiled, the expression coming more naturally than it had in months. Loved them. Our house was practically a unicorn sanctuary. He reached for the book beside him, hesitating only briefly before handing it to Layla. This was one of her favorites. I thought, maybe Maya might enjoy it. Layla accepted. The book, running her fingers over the embossed cover with its silver unicorn. That's incredibly thoughtful. Maya will treasure this. She looked up at him, her expression softening. Would you like to join us for dinner sometime? Maya would love to thank you herself. She's been working on a drawing for you. A unicorn. Of course. The invitation caught Jon off guard. His first instinct was to decline, to retreat back into the solitude that had become his comfort zone. But he thought of Maya's earnest questions, of the unexpected way their conversation had cracked open something in him that needed breaking. And he thought of what he'd realized in the days since, that maybe healing didn't mean moving on from Sarah and Ella, but rather finding new ways to carry them with him as he cautiously rejoined the world. I'd like that, he said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. As they exchanged phone numbers and made tentative plans, Jon felt something shift inside him, not an ending to his grief, which he knew would always be part of him, but perhaps the beginning of learning to live alongside it, rather than being consumed by it. He thought of Maya's question that had started all of this. Do you think God is real? Jon still didn't have a definitive answer. But sitting here on this park bench, making plans to share a meal with this woman and her philosophical daughter, he felt closer to understanding what might be sacred in this broken world. The connections we forge with each other, the love that outlasts loss, the courage to remain open to life even after it has shattered you. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like and share it with someone who might need to hear that love endures, even beyond our greatest losses. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us of the profound connections that make us human. Until next time, remember that sometimes the deepest wisdom comes from the questions children are brave enough to ask. And sometimes, in trying to answer them, we find healing we didn't know we needed.